Yeah, the title of the lecture is Non-Binary on the Spectrum, where I'm going to be talking from an intersectional perspective on topics of mental health, disability, gender, and, well, basically marginalization in a, well, ableist capitalist society, and how it affects the field of academia, and especially in higher education. Just before anything, I just want to be transparent. There will be mentions of physical violence, ableism, homophobia, endophobia, transphobia, racism, xenophobia, misogyny. Well, actually, bigotry in general, just so people know. And also, I'm just going to part from a, semantically speaking, from an argumentative point of view, where objectively calling out things that just may not be very nice to hear doesn't mean I'm attacking people. And I cannot speak for an entire group of people. So what I'm saying does not mean it's set in stone, and it's not uh, going to differ from other people that may have other opinions. So uh, even though I do a lot of political work in this field, doesn't mean what I say is some sort of gospel or rule. Um, yeah. So um, I just want to begin with a background of how we try to label things a lot in our society, where instead of being very more like open to biodiversity, we more or less stick to what we consider normal, what we consider the rule uh, of the majority, and say that is correct, and everything that just deviates from that is wrong. So while in science and biology we have biodiversity that actually well, facilitates adaptation and evolution, which is actually a good thing, we don't see that very much in the narrative of our, well, societal perspective. So there's no real, biologically speaking, there's no real way to properly develop neurologically. It's not like there's a rule. It's just an interpretation that we as humans give it. And in that sense, there's no real fundament as to why a person is wrong in their development or how they are problematic. But that just leads to narratives of, these scares of vaccines will give you autism. Autism is horrible. The families and that have children with autism are just the lives are over, and it's just such a horrible thing, and we really need to feel bad. Or you can also go to the other extreme of just not taking it seriously at all and just saying, oh, you just need to try harder, you just need to be less weird, you just need to conform, you need to adapt yourself. And I want to mention this quote from Jacqueline Houting, where she said, I'm not disabled by my autism, I'm disabled by my environment. And I think that's very important, because in my daily life, being on the autistic spectrum does not really bother me at all. I actually like it. But the problems I have are not from my disability itself, but from other people. So my problems come from basically the status quo excluding me from things. So I go out and places are crowded, people are smoking, lights are very bright, there's very loud honking noises everywhere. Um, just like the many things are just, I don't know, not wheelchair accessible. So in that sense, um, I mean, I could just kind of like make a thought experiment where if most people were autistic instead of allistic, I would just say, well, why are you so weird? Why do you, I don't know, make eye contact when you talk to me? Why do you say something but you don't mean something else? Why don't you fidget all the time when you talk? Like you're not moving your fingers when you talk. Like it's just the same narrative. It's just from the perspective of the majority that somehow tries to give it some sort of credibility, which in itself is not very scientific or valid. And not just about autism itself, regarding mental health, there's a very big stigma in our society. And it parts from the origin of it being invisible. And if we can't see it, it's not real. So depression is just being sad and we need to get over it. I don't know, if someone's on the spectrum, you seen as, I don't know, being very rude or just being eccentric, or you just want to get attention. And of course, part of not taking it seriously comes as to how people say, oh, you should just try meditating or eating better or sleeping more, as if that's somehow going to solve it, especially when you didn't ask for that kind of advice. Um, or you could also go to the other end where you say, oh, it's so cool that you have like OCD, like, that's so quirky, that's so fun. I wish I would have something like that. Another good example of that is like when I look at media, especially documentaries that talk about neurodivergent people, or even specifically autistic people. To me, it feels like it's some sort of National Geographic program where they say, and here we have the autistics, the autists in the natural habitat, they do this and they are very weird, they have this particular way of seeing the world. But then, of course, they try to give the moral of like, they're not so different from you and I. So it's like they try, such media tries to create this narrative of like, they're not that different from us, but they're not us, like there's a clear distinction. So like this authorization. And that also just like foments of like, oh, it's not really that big of a deal. So you could just change it. I mean, like, oh, why do you really have to do things in routine every day? Why do you have to do these rituals? You just have to adapt a bit. And that's basically dismissing, the actual pathological issues that come with mental health just because you cannot really see it. The other thing will just basically also a lot depicted in media is this narrative of, oh, this poor people, we need to save them. We need to do something for them. They're just helpless without us. And, someone needs to step in and do something. And that's very condescending. And just basically, it's like the savior image of someone who's very out of touch, trying to make things about themselves. And also, one thing I get a lot is people telling me, oh, but you don't look autistic, which I have never really understood because I don't really know what looking autistic means. But many people just say that I'm too smart to be autistic, because there's this basically there's this false image of like, if you work hard enough, you are intelligent, and if you're intelligent, you're a good person, because that makes you able to be integrated into society, because that way you can get a job. And if you have a disability, that it's impossible to have a disability if you are intelligent, because somehow there's this association of lacking intelligence or being less worth of participation in society and having a disability. And most of the times, any of these examples I mentioned, people don't really want to be mean, but it's just so deeply ingrained to our cultural discourse that they don't even notice. So starting to try to break these myths, I just to give some examples of like how this narrative is. Like some people say like, oh, how severe is your autism? Or like, is it very mild? Are you high functioning? But that doesn't really make sense. And just to try to drive the point home with the gender case, like we also know, I mean, gender is a social construct. I'm not talking about sex, and also like intersex is a thing. So that's also not really a thing. It's not black and white. So we know if we add more variables to it by depicting it as a spectrum, we can actually get a lot more accurate results. So we can just have different dimensions where we talk about gender expression, about sex itself in the biological terms, about gender identity, the presentation, the orientation. And that way you can actually identify and describe yourself as an individual a lot more accurately as just trying to fix in one of two boxes. And similarly, autism is not, I am more autistic or less autistic. You can't really measure it. It's not a thermometer. It's very different on every single person affected. The autism spectrum is very broad. That's why it's a spectrum. And the things that affect me probably won't affect other people. Like I have friends are also on the spectrum, and we have very different manifestations of it. So language may be an issue. A person on the spectrum may be nonverbal, have issues with writing, or even like motor skills, be hypersensitive or hyposensitive. And so, for example, just in my case, it's mostly about fixations and hypersensitivity. This is just a chart of like possible things that could be in a case like, I mean, another person may have less anxiety but more difficulty in social situations. So by that, I'm just trying to basically drive the point home of how broad it can be and how you cannot just really try to summarize it in an oversimplification. So parting from that, just to give some of your examples. For example, in my case, hypersensitivity is a case. Light can easily trigger migraine. Sound, I mean, I am wearing earplugs. I always wear earplugs. I can't really function, so to say, without earplugs, because it's not that I can hear more. It's just that I am more sensitive to the sounds I hear, and they are, so to say, very painful, especially living in a city as loud as Frankfurt. So, I mean, just things like, I don't know, if my flatmate is cooking in the kitchen and she forgets to close the door, that's not going to feel very well for me. And so it's like, it's all these things that I have to take into account in my daily life to try to circumvent, to be able to participate, so to say. Smells, I get very nauseous from the smell of cigarettes, so I have to wear masks. I used to wear masks even before the pandemic. Touch, yeah, sometimes, especially when it's like an unexpected touch, I start getting, I feel very anxious, and I start like scratching the part where I got touched, and sometimes without even noticing, maybe sometimes even until I bleed. Another case, I mean, many people on the spectrum have like a special interest, like collecting something, or reading something, or watching something, like a very, very specific thing that like they focus and they really, really want to. They always talk about that thing, and they don't really like something outside of that. For example, in my case, I have a hyperfixation on details, especially when it comes to semantics, linguistics, and argumentation. So for me, I'm very, very attentive to detail and to things like contradictions, non sequiturs, logical fallacies, things like that. And also, the part where I meant like that came in this and not taking mental health seriously is this inflexibility and need for routines. In my case, I also have ADHD and dyslexia, so it also I really rely on very strict routines to be able to function. Waking up at the same time, having things labeled and put at the same place, taking the same route. For example, I once tried to go the normal route where I walk my dog, and there was like a construction zone, and I kind of just like stood there for like 10 minutes because I didn't know what to do, because I'm not used to there being a roadblock, so I didn't know what to do. So yeah, that can just like really throw you off balance in that sense. And also, like, many people on the spectrum, especially due to misdiagnosis and also comorbidity, may also be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, specific compulsive disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, and so on. Especially in adults, autism is mostly misdiagnosed as ADHD, and also in people's seen as women in society, there's also a very high misdiagnosis. Depression is also correlated, but not just pathologically speaking, but also societally. Just you need to think about how just like there's like a high correlation between people with depression and trans people. Well, just think about how if you're told over and over again since your childhood that you're just weird, that you're just rude, and that you just need to try to be normal, but you never really let know that it's just part of you, who you are, because autism makes part of who you are, and that is something you should change, but you really can't. You're really going to be miserable living knowing that you somehow are seen as a wrong thing, like like your existence being wrong. Like that's really not going to end up well. And ignoring dangers, basically, I mean, in my case, I really have difficulty gauging how dangerous a situation can be. So, for example, if I'm crossing the street and the light is green for me, and there's a car just like really speeding towards me, I'm really thinking like, well, I mean, they can't run me over, right? Because it's green, so they have to stop, so they won't do anything. Like it's very difficult for me to really have this um, self-preservation. Like I really am lacking in that self-preservation aspect of like this biological instinct to try to survive, to say. And in my case, one of the biggest ones is communication. It's also many people on the spectrum. I take things very literally. I really struggle with like sarcasm, implications, body language, uh, wordplay, things like that. If things are not specific enough, I don't really get it. And it's also very difficult for me to just assume something that for another person is like obvious. To just, well, I mean, like for example, if I'm told to just go to renew some document and I don't show up with my passport, they say like, oh, but it's obvious that you need to bring your passport. Well, to me, it's not obvious because nobody told me. In my case, I also have selective mutism, and again, I'm not disabled by my autism, but my environment. I usually don't have problems when I have selective mutism because I just use text to speech. The problem is that many people just think that because they have seen me verbally speak before, that when I can't verbally communicate because of selective mutism, I'm just pretending. I'm just trying to call for attention or something. So that is just another emphasis of how it's my environment that causes me trouble and not my actual condition. So here I just want to give an example, at least from my perspective, of how I can try to understand or at least create a contrast between how I see autistic, like non-autistic people, and how autistic people, at least from my perspective, communicate. So for autistic people, when you are in a conversation with another person, it's really about the person itself. Who is that person? Are they my boss? Are they my relative? Are they my friend? How is what I'm going to say going to affect them? Will they be heard? Will that change my social status? Will that make them like me more? Am I doing something that's considered polite according to some social conventions? So it's really about the subjective part and the societal part of the conventions that are just like these social rules are never written anywhere. And in my case, in the autistic case, I really process it very differently. So it's really, if I were to like summarize it in one sentence, it would be like, as long as what I'm saying is factually correct, there's no reason why I shouldn't say it. So even if so it's very difficult for me to sometimes understand that I hurt somebody by saying something, because I feel like, well, but what I said is true. So I don't know, like if someone asks me like, oh, so how you like the food, I say like, oh, I think it's really bad. I it has often happened that I don't understand because they asked me how I think the food is and I really didn't like it. Or yeah, sometimes basically I just lack that the subtlety of understanding that just because something is true, some people may just not like it. And I really tend to think in this black and white thinking, where to me the important part is looking at the factual accuracy of what's being said, and not as something that was just hinted at or just implied. And I want to give an example of basically something that happened to me, and it to me it helps exemplify this disconnect between how I see things and how things are actually meant, and also the self-preservation issues. So I went to this vaccination center to get my COVID-19 vaccine, and there was this so-called employee who just said, well, you cannot come here because you have a dog and dogs are not allowed here. So I just said, well, you see, my dog is actually a service dog, and according to the law, service dogs are medical equipment. I have a medical reason why I need my dog because of my disability, and I need it because of my health. And then, a friend who was with me, she's a lawyer, she explained the legal situation. So, what I thought is like, well, I mean, I'm in the right. They cannot just deny me entry. It's a service dog. So nothing really can happen. I'll just walk back in. And I just woke up in a hospital a couple hours later because the security guard just beat me up. So yeah, that's in my mind, that could just not have happened, because I just thought, well, I mean, I have to be let in, right? But yeah, that's disconnect between how I take things literally and how there's this neurotypical aspect to the communication part. And because the lecture is called Non-Binary on the Spectrum, I also want to make a parallel to gender, and not just because there is an overlap in terms of how, for example, 70% of the population that is autistic is heterosexual, while 70% of the autistic population is not heterosexual, or how 1/3 of the people that are on the spectrum identify as non-binary, or how there's also this problem in people seen as women that are very highly misdiagnosed, because since there is this, we live in a sexist patriarchal society. So there are gender norms of how people seen as women should perform and how they should behave. And that leads to a lot of behaviors that are very indicative of someone requiring or a diagnosis of autism just being brushed off very easily, because for example, if someone has a meltdown, then someone may just say, oh, that's just a mood swing. Or also there's this like expectation of this general norm of performance of how you need to women need to interact more and be more expressive, but also shy, more reserved, and that leads to like this forced increase in human interaction, which leads to this term called camouflaging, where basically you learn to pretend to be you are neurotypical to try to fit into society, and that just makes the diagnosis process a lot more complicated because it's a lot more difficult to catch. But apart from the more so to say psychological aspect of it, if we're talking about the societal overlaps of intersection, being disabled is being a minority, just like being a woman is being a minority, being trans persons being a minority. So the problem, at least if we look at it, for example, with trans people, the overlap is very clear to see. So, for example, if I introduce myself to a group of students, well, actually this happens quite a lot. I am most of the time either asked, why do I have a dog? And really nosy questions like, oh, but what's your diagnosis why you need a dog? Or where are you from? Where you're from, or things like that. So I am essentially being reduced to, I am that trans person, or I am the disabled person with the service dog, or I am the foreign person, and I'm not seen as an equal by such a group. So my personality starts and ends at being this token or this label of the intersection that I have. So I'm not really seen or treated as an equal in that sense. Um, and that just creates further like distance and uh, distance between me and the other people, because I'm not really seen as one of them, because I'm just seen as like, oh, you know, yeah, they're just the quirky foreign person, blah blah blah. It's like so I'm not seeing at the same standards as they are. And for example, in Germany, sadly, being trans is still seen as being mentally ill. If you want to be able to change your name, pronouns, and get medical healthcare related to transitioning, you have to say you are mentally ill and get diagnosed with transsexualism. I mean, just this narrative just is trying to legitimize this sort of normalized intolerance through saying, oh, but this is the science, this is the biology. So that's it's just kind of like a way to try to rationalize it, to not appear bigoted, but just to be, oh, I'm just following the science. And problematic is also when you belong to more than one intersection. So thing is, being part of a marginalized minority is already kind of a problem, because you're like, oh yeah, but now we have to change things and I need to learn your pronouns, and that's so much work. And oh, I need to make sure I don't say something triggering or no. And like, I get, so it's like, oh, change is bad. I want things to stay the way they are because I basically benefit from the status quo because I'm a privileged person, and therefore it's tedious. So if you have more than one intersection, then it's like asking for too much. It's like, oh, so on top of being disabled, now I have to also be PC about being trans. So for example, at school, I was taking a test, and I was with my service dog, so I cannot go to a normal toilet because I don't fit. And I asked, well, the person that was overseeing the test, and she said, oh, there's a unisex bathroom in the first floor. And I said, like, yeah, but is it like wheelchair accessible? And she's like, it's unisex. I said, like, yeah, but you see, I have a service dog, I cannot go to a normal toilet, I need a wheelchair accessible toilet. And she's like, the first floor has a unisex toilet. Like, it's like, I don't really know if she was just ignoring me and someone just told her, oh, I'm trans and that's why you need to be careful when they ask something. But like, the point is completely missed. Just because I'm trans, that doesn't mean I cannot need a wheelchair accessible toilet. And going back to this legitimization of some bogus science, I more or less had two coming out as trans and coming out as someone on the spectrum were very different. Sadly, I still feel like being trans is not as way less understood and less tolerated than being on the spectrum, because for autism, at least, it's like, oh, okay, if you have a diagnosis, I guess it's the thing. And I mean, so it's like people more reluctantly accept it. But for example, even my therapist said, like, oh, I don't want to get into this whole diagnosis thing because I feel like you have more important things in your life right now and you need to work out your stress and your university, and I think this is not that important for you right now. And it's often just dismisses how you feel, and as if like feeling something is irrelevant, and therefore we should just focus on something more tangible, I guess. So in that sense, it's like you have to somehow push until you find a way to force the other person who's to be willing to acknowledge you as who you identify, and that's like on their own terms. And if you just feel a way, that is just not very important. And if they say, okay, then I will learn your pronouns, but I will not. I will not use your new name because until you change it on your passport, you won't do it. It's too much work for me. So it just leads to this dynamic where the other person um, feels like they're doing you a favor because you're creating this chore, you're giving them work to do, and they will only do it as much as they feel they have to, and you should be grateful that they're doing it at all. And also something people of color and queer people, I'm pretty sure many of you will be familiar with this. It's when privileged people, people that just don't know about your intersection, ask you to somehow be the search engine. And instead of Googling something and doing research, you need to educate them on how to be respectful or how something works or what being queer is or what a term is. And so basically, if you don't, it leads to like this expectation of, if you don't educate me, I'm not going to even try to be respectful because it's somehow your job, not that I'm going to pay you for the education. I mean, this time, I guess I am more or less doing the education because it's a lecture, but I mean in a conversation. um, yeah. So on top of that, something that really permeates pretty much any intersection is living in a capitalist society. In itself, diversity, it's incompatible with capitalism because we are just trying to fit into a system that sees us as a way to generate profit for some sort of, for just some random corporation. And we just need to generalize it, everybody, label everybody as efficiently as we can. And the focus of society is just create profit and increase the profit that you're creating and always make more profit. Of course, it's not sustainable, but I mean, that's just how capitalism works. So there's this paper from 1930 by Jeremiah Keynes, an economist, where he just calculated that based on economic growth and technological developments, by 2030, we should be able to just work 15 hours a week and be as well off as we are, or even better than we are right now. And I don't have the reference right now, but there was an actual study on in the eight that took his calculations, and based on his paper, since the 1980s, we have already passed the threshold of his prediction. So we actually have the means to work less than what we work right now, this 15 hour that he mentioned. We just always want to work more because of course we always need more profit. And we create this, we just taught since we're children that we just need to work. We if we don't work, we're lazy. We always have to work. We need to be productive. If we take take time for ourselves, take mental health times, things like that, that's just being lazy. We're just not trying hard enough. We just want government handouts, things like that. And that just leads to just work being so ubiquitous, as like we just don't even question why we should be working 40 hours a week. And people are like, yeah, I mean, yeah, I may be working 40 hours a week, but I'm getting paid. And we're like even happy about it. And we come to the point where so many things are automated that we just need to create more work or jobs that don't really make sense. So if any of you ever have this misfortune of going on LinkedIn, you will see a bunch of people in nice suits with really dumb job titles that like uh architect of uh enterprise compliance or something, just buzzwords of people that just do white collar jobs that don't really do anything, or than just probably some logistics for some corporation that don't really benefit society at all. And not just that, but that also leads to, if you don't work, you don't make money. If you don't make money, you're less worth as a person, because the more money you make, the more status you have. So since psychology, arts, education, gastronomy, those things don't make money, so that's just stupid. Your work as a scientist, I don't know, you're not making money. That's just so stupid, like you're but like we I mean, it's very uh frowned upon in like my culture to study something like, I don't know, music, because it doesn't make money and you will starve. And yeah, I recommend the book Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, which is really goes deep into what I just mentioned. um and now with trans people and people with disabilities, um we can really see it how many of these campaigns of tolerance and integrating diversity and people with disabilities into society, it's lots of people of like, you see, I have Down syndrome, but I work at a factory, and therefore I am a productive member of society because I am making some sort of billionaire more money by so that they can just continue to exploit me. But if I didn't work, I would somehow be not respected. So the respect or value that you have as a member of society is only granted to you if you are productive. And if you're not, then you're not going to be tolerated. So yeah, okay. You may have autism, but that's only really okay if you're high functioning. If you're very smart, okay, yeah, you see, oh, we love to have you in our company. So that's, for example, uh, infamous video game development companies that specifically target um, um, game developers on the autistic spectrum, because they want employees that work a lot and have less social life. And that's just a way to basically weaponize capitalism to oppress people with disabilities, and then say, oh, we have a bunch of people that have autism. Actually, we're very diverse. um, so um, on top of that, like, I mean, I have had jobs offers that I've been rejected for because of my disability, and it more or less makes sense with this notion of always increasing profit. So if I have a disability, and then some workplace, some office or something needs to be changed a bit so that I can be accommodated, that's going to be extra work, extra resources, and money for the company. That's not very good. It's just not. It's not really compatible with always increasing profit. So, um, of course, most of the time they just say, oh, we didn't give you the job because we have someone more qualified. Well, I mean, actually they don't tell you why, but what happens. I mean, I personally was actually told that it was because of having a service dog, but it usually doesn't happen. So what that leads to is to trans people or people with disabilities just never disclosing that they have a disability, because they fear that if they do, they will never get a job, and then basically they fear for their safety, because if they don't have a job, they cannot really survive. So in a sense, it's a survival strategy. Um, and yeah, so before I start with uh, special case, I want to really mention something that is very prevalent in society. We put a lot of emphasis on intentions and very little emphasis on impact. And that is how institutions, people, and corporations that oppress others or discriminate get away with it, because basically it doesn't matter what you did or didn't do, because you meant well. So you should really be rewarded for trying or for wanting to do the right thing. And derived from that is, for example, if you do something that's bigoted, racist, transphobic, Islamophobic, ableist, if you don't flat out say it, but you actually feel that, oh, I'm against homophobia, I don't like to discriminate. That way you are implicitly discriminating, but by openly disavowing something, you are creating this deflection where you kind of like exonerate, because then you can be basically, oh, I'm on the record saying I'm against homophobia, so I cannot do anything wrong. And if you try to confront such a person, then a very common response would be to feel attacked, and to then shift the conversation as to why you are attacking me and why you're being so aggressive, away from the actual issue of confronting the people in front of you. So I have this small pipeline where, for example, so society sees bigotry as a bad thing. So let's say ableism is a bad thing. So that implies that if the person that does it, if the person that's being homophobic or bigoted admits it, that implies that they did something wrong, something that society doesn't like. So that's where the cognitive dissonance kicks in. And since they cannot just, it's impossible for them to think that they would ever do something bigoted, because doing something bigoted would associate them with bigotry, then that just means it's impossible. So, I mean, they meant something well, and since they meant it well, then it's impossible that they did something wrong, so that they're innocent. And then that means that the person that said that they did something bigoted is actually misrepresenting them or attacking them, and they are the victim. And the other person that's calling them out is just really trying to, I don't know, cancel them with just some angry social justice warrior. And by that, they just manage to get away with getting no responsibility, because they say they're not doing anything wrong. And since they're not doing anything wrong, nothing changes. So, and then just, well, it repeats over and over again. Now that I told you more or less what not to do, what the bad things are, I also want to talk about things that could be good to do. So first of all, autism is not an illness. There's no magic cure for autism. I don't want a magic cure for autism. I don't care what Elon Musk says or whatever. I don't have autism. I'm on the spectrum. And also, I am not my disability. And it's not something that everyone has just because, I don't know, just because you like things ordered in a certain way, that doesn't mean you have a bit of OCD. It's a very different thing. And by saying that, you're basically just invalidating it by thinking it's something quirky. In the same way, I found out that in German, it's still very normalized to use the R word. So when you say something is dumb, you often say, oh, that's so R-worded. And apparently the word behindert, which means retarded, it's still very prevalent. I was a bit shocked to know that. And of course, we have the the classic examples of like, oh, if someone changes their mind, people are going to say, oh, she's so bipolar, which just shows you don't know what bipolar means. If something is out of place, then people will say that triggers my OCD, which also just invalidates and basically implies that having OCD is just a quirky thing of like, oh, I like things in a certain way, instead of an actual thing that impacts my daily life. So you should not use any of these. Instead, first of all, we're talking about spectrum. And also, again, I cannot speak for everyone. So don't say something like, well, I have an autistic friend that say it's okay to say they're an autist. Instead of that, just listen to the other person and don't try to insert yourself and say, oh, you know what, it's fine. You should just, I will give you some unsolicited advice and be very condescending. So just try to listen and really not try to generalize things. Again, it's not about you. If someone is telling you about how they're trans, if someone is telling you about how they have a disability, you don't need to say, oh yeah, you know, actually I was also depressed one day too. And I don't know if people do that because they want to sound relatable, but that's just kind of, you really should not do that, because it just makes it look like you're belittling the importance of the plight of the other person. So you don't need to just say, oh yeah, you know, something like that happened to me too, or yeah. And again, just because you meant something well doesn't mean you did well. And I think it's important. And it also, I think I have a lot of respect for people that are able to own up to something just because they didn't mean it. Just because someone did something wrong and didn't mean it, that doesn't mean I hate them. But I am more likely to be inclined to not want to talk to the person if they keep defending themselves after I pointed out that it's wrong, instead of just trying to understand that they did it, that they were hurtful or discriminatory, despite not wanting to do so. Also, you should not say, "Oh, I will just, I don't know, I will just use your name, but I will not use your pronouns," or "I will only do it if you give me a 20-minute explanation how being trans works," or things like that. Also, if you ask for someone for education, that you at least pay them. So I'm being paid, so it's okay. I'm for this education, so I guess it's fine. But I mean, in a conversation, you should not expect that you are somehow entitled to the marginalized person to educate you. And that is not a prerequisite for you to be tolerant towards their situation. Then again, if you're not asked for advice, you don't have to try to insert yourself on how you think you would cure the disability, or how would you make them go around the problems. If you are a trans person that has problems because of transphobia, if you are a person that has problems with because of the disability, you probably think about that every single day. So you have probably think of every single thing the other person is going to give you as an advice, and you probably don't need that. Also, things are not bidirectional. Just like racism is not something that goes both ways. Just because I say something like, I don't know, if a person of color says something about white people, that doesn't mean that white people can say something about marginalized people, because the social dynamic of oppression and the power structures that allow systematic oppression are not there. So it's not about, oh, but you did this, so I somehow that justifies that I also treat you like that. And now that I want to go specifically into the field of academia, specifically the field of higher education. So there is a very big disconnect between the rights a person has and the rights a person actually is granted by society. And of course, the more of a minority, let's say, you are, the more evident this becomes. So in theory, as a student with disabilities, you are entitled to getting accommodation so that you are able to perform just with the same opportunity that a student without disabilities has. As long as it's not something like making a new building, if it's something that's already there, the resources are almost always there. So there's no, like, at least legally and financially speaking, there's no real excuse for that. And it's not really something that should like be like you're just entitled to it because you're entitled to equality. And if you have a disability, well, basically the accommodation helps you that to circumvent some of the difficulties that you have. This does not mean that somehow only if you have a disability, you only get accommodations if you're a very good student. It's not something you have to earn. I mean, statistically speaking, not everybody will perform the same, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. But that doesn't mean you don't have the same opportunity of being treated with equality just because your grades are not as good. So that it's not something you have to earn, like you're entitled to it just by being a person. On top of that, the people that in a university give you such accommodations, things like extra time, having the chance to take a different type of examination if you, for example, have problems writing maybe an oral test, something like that. The people that, so to say, decide that, they grant you that, it's just an evaluation board of professors And I mean, it's really not that difficult to understand. I mean, they are not doctors, and even if they were, they're not your doctors. So they're not there to make medical decisions. You, as a student, just present the difficulties that you have. You explain how your disability affects you and what you would need to improve the situation so that you can study closer to being on par with an able-bodied or non-disabled student. Um, you don't really, theoretically, you don't even have to say what you have, because again, they are not doctors. You don't need to prove your innocence and based on some, like, I don't know, it's not like you have to prove that you really are disabled as long as you have the right documentation. I mean, you have the right to just not have to divulge personal medical things with every professor in a university. Um, and it's not something where you should just like see what they give you, and it's not something where you're just like like being conceited by asking for accommodations, but it's just something that you need to be able to participate with the same opportunity that a normal person without disabilities has. Um, and on top of that, there are things where universities and institutions are not allowed to intervene at all, which is just medical equipment. So, for example, having a cochlear implant, using a wheelchair, having a service dog, using text to speech. Those are not accommodations that the university grants or the institution grants. Those are medical equipments that are protected by law, and an institution has no right to allow or ban them because, I mean, why? I mean, why would some professor have the authority to say you're not allowed to come in here with your wheelchair? It makes absolutely no sense. Now, in reality, yeah, in reality, it's a mess. So again, parting from this fake narrative of the meritocracy, the status quo is being able to speak, being able to see, being able to hear, having no mental health issues, everything. So if you don't fit that, you need to try hard. You just need to put some effort in and be normal, or try to just fit in. It's that you're just encouraged to try to fit in, and that's where the always, at least in my case, it's always you're so capable. I bet if you just try a bit harder, you wouldn't have any problems. um Also, most of the cases, institutions will just ignore any request for accommodations if you don't provide a diagnosis. So you're basically sacrificing your right to privacy to be able to be taken seriously. And what I mentioned earlier is about this authority that they don't have. Well, it's just completely ignored. So this group of professors that have no real knowledge about, well, your disability or disabilities in general, they somehow determine if you really deserve, or if you need, or if it's really important or necessary that you have an accommodation. And sometimes the reasonings are either completely arbitrary, or they try to rationalize it by saying, oh, if we give you extra time in a test, that would not be fair to the other students. And also, I think time pressure is important and it's part of the final score. So we cannot really give you extra time. We're just following rules. So there's just trying to find some sort. So just like how the media uses this pseudoscientific base to sound more credible, in this case, is the fairness, or the rules are just this bogus way to try to justify the oppression. Um, and again, in it also becomes this sort of Stockholm syndrome dynamic where you kind of like have to go to the evaluation board and you have to beg them and say, okay, look, I have these problems. Please, can you please, I don't know, give me extra time or let me take it in a different room or something. I cannot take the test in such a big room. And basically, you need to go in with the mentality that they will either completely reject what you ask for, or they will give you less. And whatever they give you is whatever you have to be happy with. You need to be very grateful, and you just because they're doing you a favor. They're very kind. They're very, very gracious of doing this, because they create, like in this manufactured scenario, they don't have to do anything, but they're so nice that they are giving you 20 minutes extra in a test. And you shouldn't ask more than that. I mean, like, you're already given 20 minutes, so like, stop demanding so much, and just be very, very grateful that we're so nice. And well, having those things just gives the university further claims on how diverse they are, and just creates this empty image of the pipeline that I mentioned before. We disavow discrimination, but we don't do anything about it, but we disavow it. So therefore, we cannot do anything wrong. And for example, in my case, every single time something, well, I mean, like, I have had the government, lawyers, organizations intervene to the point where it has been legally shown that it is discrimination if I'm treated differently because of my disability, or if I am held at the same standards as a person without disabilities. Um, and sometimes even the answer is just, well, if you really think we are doing something wrong, you could always sue us. I mean, you're open to that. And that basically just works in favor of the institution, because that actually, first of all, it makes them look like they are understanding, or like that they have some sort of accountability, because they're like, oh, well, I mean, they are giving you this option, but in reality, it's not really an option at all, because first of all, we need to take into account how I mentioned that these societal issues just permeate every part of society. That's why systemic and institutional discrimination uh, doesn't really is not really limited to just university. It's basically part of our society. So if I do go to sue a university and I somehow have the money for it, I would probably take 2 or so years before it goes to court. And that means that if I argue that I am being discriminated because of my disability, or that my disability is not being taken into account, and therefore I'm not being graded fairly, that means that until that is resolved, I cannot take any other courses, because, well, I mean, if I do take more courses, then that would mean that I don't think anymore that I'm being discriminated. So I basically have to put my whole studies on hold until I guess that is sorted out, which would take 2 or 3 years. I don't know. And we also need to take into account that not just I mean, the time and the cost already gives the university the so to say, this safety of knowing, yeah, they probably will not go through with it. And the thing is, even if you go through with it, the judges are also privileged people that are part of the system, so they have the same mentality. So it's more than likely that they will rule in favor of the institution that is oppressing you. So, for example, there was this student that had an accident, and a chunk of his brain was destroyed, and he cannot communicate anymore. And therefore, he cannot communicate verbally, and he requested the chance of having an interpreter for his tests. And the school rejected that, and he went to a lawsuit, and then uh, after years, he lost the case because of the judge's ruling in favor of the school. So if such a case that's so blatant fails, something that is more mild, that's, I don't know, someone with ADHD or someone on the spectrum, it's very unlikely that will happen. So what that ends up being in reality is, you as a person with disabilities have to kind of just decide whether you want to pursue higher education, or whether you want to, well, take your health into consideration, because the institution is not going to really accommodate for you, even though they should. So you have to try to push yourself beyond what you should be doing, or try to somehow just compensate for the things that you are not getting help with, to try to more or less keep up and be normal and fit in. So, for example, in my case, I have uh, cases where the professors just say like, oh, well, I mean, I cannot just explain things more explicitly to you because inferring implicit information is part of the competences and skills that you need to learn here. So I cannot do that. And it just, for example, just the mere fact that I have to finish my studies in the same time that a person without disabilities, even though last semester I get sick so often that for example, last semester I was sick for 2 months. So it doesn't really make sense that I would even be able to finish in the same time as a student without disabilities. But that just leads up to a scenario where, for example, I don't know, eating 2 meals a day, sleeping 6 hours a day, and working 10 to 12 hours a day, just trying to meet the deadlines of the university and barely holding on or even failing at it, just because I need to fit in instead of the university trying to actually, well, be consequent and take action to accommodate me. Um, and as I mentioned, like with the judges, this part of this narrative of, well, exclusion is present and prevalent in every aspect of society. And language is also a part of it. Um, so, first of all, just think about how so many things in our daily lives, as I said, are not wheelchair accessible, are reliant on sound or vision, and just leaves a bunch of people out of it, even though minor changes could be a lot more inclusive. Um, so again, the example of the semesters to finish, and so I learned that in German, many universities use the term Nachteilsausgleich, which I think translates to a disadvantage compensation. And that in itself, I mean, yeah, I get some people will say, oh, it's just a word. But the thing is, it's so deeply, actually, the language, we know that language does have an impact in how we act and perceive things as a society. And by having a word that basically says that when you get some sort of accommodation by the university that somehow completely compensates or deletes your disability, it implies that just because you got 20 minutes or something, that you are in the same position as student without disabilities. And that's, I mean, that couldn't be further from the truth, because I'm not saying that I need, for example, special treatment, that I need easier marks, or that I just need someone to just give me a degree out of pity. But the thing is, I will never have it the same way as a student without disabilities has. I will always have it harder. Like even outside of, like, a student without disabilities will not get sick as often. I still have um, problems finding jobs, problems finding apartments, because I have so many people that just said, oh, I don't want to live with people with disabilities. There's, of course, also the communication issues that people with autism are seen as weird or eccentric. People don't want to live with me because they have a service dog, things like that. So in so many aspects, actually every single aspect of my life is permeated by my disability or how my environment disables me. So just because some university says, oh, I'm going to give you 20 minutes more, that doesn't mean my disability is gone. And that in itself is, that's why I say I think it should be a reduction and not a compensation, because even if something's granted, especially with how things really are, it's just a very minor help of what should uh, out of what should really be granted. Um, and well, the status quo being able-bodied and not having being neurotypical, be autistic, well, I mean, by inertia, things tend to be the way they are and stay the way they are, and many people profit from it. So it just leads to also this fake rationalization of, well, I mean, it's always been like that. So, I mean, what do you expect? it's not like we can change it, because changing it would take a lot of work, and that will take money, and that would take resources. And we're just learning about this. Is probably the first. I have had so many university employees tell me, this is very new to us. We just need to learn about it. But of course, they're always learning about it, and I guess and it will not really change anything. And also, I guess in Germany it's kind of easy since there's so much bureaucracy. But another way of like getting rid of this accountability is kind of like trying to create this claim of not being able to do something because of it being outside of someone's jurisdiction. So if the university says like, oh, actually this accommodation, I don't think we can do it as a university. Maybe uh, you should talk to the government, or there's this law, or you should probably talk to an organization that can help you. Maybe you can talk to your health insurance and get some help, or get a caretaker. But we can't really do this. So it's always someone else's fault. If it's not you as a student who have to do the work, the research, or just compensate for things yourself by just working yourself to death, then it's always someone else. It's either the government or it's either some organization, but it's never the people that actually have the authority to do things. And also, well, parting from the fact that having things like an anti-discrimination office already implies that there's a problem, because there shouldn't be so many different anti-discrimination places in an institution. So just having so many already shows there's a big problem, and that the system in itself is flawed. So for example, my university, there are several so-called representatives of students with disabilities, but they don't really know how the studies work. They are very complacent with how things are, and very quick to defend the university. And they're not really professors or any sort of lecturers. So they don't really know how it works, and they're also not taken seriously. So even if they mean well, they either give up too quickly. They don't really fight for the representation of people with disabilities, because, well, they're paid by the place they're, so to say, fighting, or they're just not going to be taken seriously because they're just some employee. And I also personally don't feel very represented by some privileged person with no disabilities that knows nothing about my case, and also doesn't really know anything about the studying situation, and thinks everything can be solved by just trying a bit harder, or just maybe asking a professor if they can be a bit kinder on me or something. I don't know. So just a couple of other tactics that are very, very prevalent, both in the corporate world and also in the education world in institutions, is, of course, if you are oppressed, you become the victim. So again, feelings are something somehow bad. And so if you're angry, your argument is invalid. You cannot be angered that you're being treated differently. You cannot be angry that you got kicked out of a place, because as soon as you're angry, somehow your argumentation is no longer valid, and we will not talk to you. Then also, for example, very, very often, I have had professors or the people say, well, if you felt offended, I'm sorry. But that in itself is just an implicit invalidation, because first of all, I was offended, and second of all, it's not a conditional. You don't have to ask if, because you by saying if you were offended, you're basically leaving it very ambivalent as to whether it happened or not. And by stressing how you felt instead of you were offended, you kind of downplay it by saying, well, it's just you had that impression, but you weren't really offended. Or it was not really a bad thing. So basically you try to make it, you create an abstraction from what really happened to this subjective relativization of, well, no, it actually just, you had that impression, but it didn't really happen like that. And of course, if you're being confronted because you are either a person who profits from this status quo and the process of it, well, either you're a victim or you're just, I didn't know. It's very new to me. I'm just, I'm just a professor. I'm just an old white man. What can I do, right? So, um, you need to take my feelings into account, and you need to be more. You need to have a bit more compassion on me, I guess. And I mean, just like for example with the whole transgender bathroom issues, I have so many examples of professors that have said, well, if we give you extra time, everyone will want extra time, and then everyone will start just going to saying that they have a disability just so that they can study for 10 years or something. So we cannot do that. And it's just creating this false narrative that, of course, I'm pretty sure, I mean, out of thousands of students, there may be someone who's actually willing to, well, instrumentalize his abilities to abuse the system and get more time because they're just lazy. But not just because that's a very tiny amount, but just for this unconfirmed fear that you don't know, you're basically denying the rights of an entire group of marginalized people. And also one of my favorites, well, not really my favorites, but for example, where I did my bachelor's, I was asked every single semester to take a picture for the website because they love having foreigners and brown people and whatnot to show how diverse they are. But of course, I mean, they may have like a rainbow flag sticker somewhere, but just because you have some sort of symbolism doesn't mean that you actually care or you're actually diverse or inclusive. I mean, having some sort of poster saying, "Oh, we love foreigners and we love LGBTQAI plus people," doesn't really help much. I mean, it's not like you're actually creating programs or lectures or groups. That is actually just a way for you to get good images and PR, and you're actually using minorities for your own purposes. I mean, in this case, the institutions. So basically, I just wanted to get this example of this narrative that the university or the people in power, and actually doesn't have to be an institution, it can also be a person that benefits from the status quo. It's basically using the pipeline that I mentioned before, just because, I mean, I disavow something, so it cannot be possible. I didn't mean it, so it cannot be possible. And what you're saying is bigotry, and bigotry is a bad thing. I cannot be a bad person, so that's impossible. So in that way, it's basically saying, I mean, if it's impossible that you would ever be discriminated, right? Because that would mean that there are bad people out there, that they are abusing their power, and that's impossible because I'm one of those people, so it's just impossible that I could ever do something wrong, because I've been in this working job for so long that not that being in a job for long really changes anything, but that's a kind of argumentation that I have to encounter every single time when I either represent myself or represent all the students with disabilities at the university in my political work. So I wanted to mention a couple of real life cases that happened to me to just really drive the point home of how this discrimination is normalized to the point where it's really just accepted. And if it's not accepted, it's just kind of like reluctantly ignored by saying, oh, well, I mean, what can we do? It's always been like that, or we cannot really change anything. So again, for example, here, I got a letter from this place where I did my bachelor's that said that I cannot have accommodations because my marks are too good. So I guess it's impossible to be disabled and intelligent at the same time. So yeah, and um, the second case, there was this lecturer that wanted to well, not let me take a test because there was an attendance rule for the class, and you were not allowed to be absent. And I told her they knew about my disability because that lecturer is part of the evaluation board. They know that I get sick very often. I had the documentation for every class and for every single day that I was sick. And well, she just made it seem like I just missed the entire semester instead of just being sick one time, and that I was just trying to get like a special treatment by not by asking them to let me take the test anyway. And of course, she sprinkled some racism on it, of course, because it's Germany, and I guess I'm a savage foreign person that does things differently. And I mean, of course, she's of course relying on this rule of law thing again, where like, yeah, I mean, have to follow the rules. You are not there, so I'm going to ignore the fact that you were reasonably and documentedly sick. Um, this one, I was at a building and this janitor tried to kick me out and called security on me because he said I look like a criminal and I don't look like a student and I'm there either to break or steal things. And he said that I have to take off my mask and tell him what my diagnosis is, or he will just call security, I guess, because according to him, he needs to know what my diagnosis is. And I was naive enough to think that the director of this place that happened to walk by would be professional about it and would de-escalate the situation, but he didn't. So basically, he tried to grab my phone because he thought I was going to record him. I was just trying to use text to speech or whatever. He tried to grab my phone because I guess, like he had to protect himself or whatever. So he tried to grab my phone and said, "You need to leave because this is my university, and yeah, you can only be here with a dog if I allow it, and I don't. So security will escort you outside." And yeah, that really sucked, especially for someone who's allegedly the director of a place. I mean, it's quite laughable. So then, I contacted a lawyer and the Ministry of Education because I found it outrageous that I was harassed, threatened, and kicked out of a building because of a service dog by the director of a place. And I was invited with huge quotation marks to a talk, but I was told I'm not allowed to bring a lawyer. I was naive enough to know it. You're not allowed to deny a person the right to legal representation. So I went without a lawyer. And then he said, it was an experience. It was not good. It was not bad. So that's why it's not a bad thing. It was just an experience. So I don't have to defend myself. I am just a director. I'm not perfect. I couldn't know that that it's a service dog, even though I said it was a service dog or whatever. I couldn't know that I couldn't kick you out. So you can't expect me to know everything. And actually, because of your complaint, I had to explain myself in front of the Ministry of Education, and that made me very uncomfortable. So I guess he's the very true victim in that situation. And there's another case where, I had a presentation, and because of selective mutism, I had to use text to speech. So I presented and I was asked questions. I used text to speech to answer. Nothing happened. Then I got a letter where I was invited again to a meeting with the head of the evaluation board. And again, I was not allowed to go with a lawyer. I didn't know that I could still bring a lawyer because it's my right, but I was dumb enough to go without a lawyer. And then, well, this professor, head of the evaluation board, well, he said that I was cheating for using text to speech to communicate during a presentation. And he said he was going to give me an option, and he said he was going to make me an offer. So he said I can either have it count as a cheating attempt, which is stupid because why would I willingly have a cheating attempt? He could say I could just fail the test, or he could say I could just do the whole module again, or he also said I could just get a bad mark. So not really a choice. Every single option that he gave you is not really an option. I don't want to take any of those. So I guess it was just for him to look as he's gracious giving me an option. And on top of that, he was just basically creating this narrative of how I probably just recorded something on my phone or something weeks before the presentation, and that therefore it's not a presentation because it was probably a video from weeks before, which is not true. That's not how text-to-speech works. And that I somehow am the problem because I really scared and overwhelmed the professor because, she had never seen a case like that. And they expect that in the university, everyone can speak, So I asked if he actually expects students that cannot speak to study to speak during such a presentation, and he said yes. So I asked, like, wait, so you mean you can't study if you can't speak? And he actually said, which is of course illegal, but he said that for a student that can't speak or student with disability to be able to study, they have to get the permission of the evaluation board, which is just outrageous. But hey, I mean, what am I gonna do? Sue them, right? So yeah, I mean, it's just quite shocking to me how blatantly open he was about knowing that, explicitly saying that the university is not made for people with disabilities. So yeah, so on top of that, basically I tried to explain to him that it is discrimination if you hold me to the same standards as a person without disabilities. And funnily enough, he did mention my service dog, and not in a way of, I mean, he actually went as far as say that I am causing trouble for the normal students. He was very adamant of that way, to normal students, because I'm impairing them with my disability by having a service dog. So because some people are afraid of dogs or have allergies, I am a problem for them. And I am not accepting of normal people by bringing a service dog. And I even had like another, like, actually that happened a lot. I had lecturers try to kick me out of buildings because of my service dog. And even though they knew about the medical and legal situation, because I talked to them a lot of times, and lawyers and government employees had to talk to them, this lecturer even said that I need the approval of the evaluation board to be able to have a service dog there. And I mean, it's also conflict of interest because, like, I mean, she is a member of the service of the evaluation board, so she knows it is not allowed by the board. Not that it has the authority to do so, but yeah. And going back to the tactics that I mentioned before, so this professor was repeatedly threatening to end this so-called meeting because I told him that that he was being discriminatory, and to him that was an insult. So because I pointed out that he was objectively discriminating against me, he felt insulted by me, and that was a personal attack. And that was, I guess, he didn't want to talk anymore because in his eyes, since he didn't want to discriminate me, that made everything okay and justifies every action or inaction from his part. And yeah, so as I mentioned, the real victim, according to that professor, was the lecturer that took where I did the presentation, because she was very afraid that I used text-to-speech to communicate. And I guess really just somehow he was really trying to justify discrimination by saying, well, I mean, it has never happened before, and I've been at the evaluation board for 19 years, so it's impossible that I'm doing something wrong. And well, he actually went to say that I should be grateful that I am able to have my service dog with me. But the thing is, they always create this narrative of, it's a process, we're learning, we need to educate ourselves. It's a very long process to change the entire system. But that is basically just a cop-out to create this narrative of, we are bettering ourselves. But in reality, it's just empty words to not do anything, because it took more than 3 semesters worth of letters, government, and legal involvement to call out the university to let me go to this place without being harassed by employees and professors. And even though they had the legal documentation and everything since the very first semester, after 3 semesters where this meeting took place, he was still saying that I am a problem for his students with by having a dog. So it just shows that they didn't learn anything, and they're just trying to maintain the power that they have by not changing anything and cementing their own authority. So it just shows that there's no real intention to change, and just creating this image of being diverse is good for good PR, I guess, and press, and yeah. So I mean, I guess, as I mentioned, I over-focus on details. So I tried to explain to this professor how his circular logic was working. So I managed to get him, like, a really, really little child to make almost every single understanding point until the end, but he failed at the end. So I explained to him, he acknowledges that the regulations and the module handbook and whatnot are not made for people without disabilities. So in those cases, the student with disabilities needs to make a request so that their specific case is taken into account and not the generalized normal regulations. And he said yes. And then, but then he also says that in such a case, since the normal regulations are so overgeneralized, you need to ignore the normal regulations and look at a specific case, because I mean, of course, people with disabilities are still more or less an exception or a minority. So such a generalized book doesn't hold up. But then he says, well, I mean, we still rejected your request because it was against the regulations, even though we say that in your case, your request should not be according to the regulation, but to your special case. So it just goes in a circle that just kind of like, it's just circular logic. So you need to make a request because it's not according to the rules, and but we'll reject it because the rules say so. And then, yeah, I tried to get help from the student committee. I thought as students they would be better at representing me. It failed miserably. The representative of students of this place where it was actually says that I deserve to get a bad mark, because in the end, no matter whether I have a disability or not, I was not able to communicate. So it would be unfair for someone who cannot communicate to get as good a mark as a person who can't communicate. So I guess, I mean, yeah, I guess I should just we should put people on wheelchairs at the same races as 50-meter sprints as able-bodied people, because otherwise it would be unfair, right? So on top of that, she did not just say that I deserve a bad mark, but she also said that I should just tell employers if they ever ask about something like that, about bad mark or something, and that maybe they will have understanding, but only under certain conditions. So I guess like I need to fit into what they believe I deserve in terms of respect, and I need to take those conditions. Although, but more respect than that, I don't. It's not really something I am entitled to. I need to earn that tolerance from them until the point that they want to grant me. And she even went to say that, well, I mean, if I don't really like this world the way it is with the ableism, I should just change it, right? Because of course, again, it's my obligation as the oppressed person to do all the work, right? The system doesn't have to change. It's my problem. Yeah. So in this other case, I was having a lot of issues in a project with the same professor that said that she was scared for me using text to speech because students didn't want to work with me because they said that they didn't want to have to talk to trans people and to migrants, which I'm both. So they didn't want to talk to me, and they were very disrespectful. And so I filed a report, and then she was issued a citation by the anti-discrimination office, and then she just sat us down in the election and said, well, you see, there has been a report that someone's being bullied and discriminated. And I said, is that true? If it's true, please confirm. I said, yes. And she just said, well, has it been solved? And I said, no. And then she said, well, I mean, legally speaking, all I have to do is ask whether it happened or not and acknowledge that it happened. But if it hasn't been solved, I did my legal obligation of asking, and now I'm free of any responsibility. Please leave me out. Don't talk to me about it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So yeah, that's very professional, I guess, to just not not take any accountability or try to do anything in a place that always touts so much diversity and inclusion. So yeah. And the same professor, I had a meltdown during the presentation where I hyperventilated and I had to go to the clinic. And I noticed that I was hyperventilating, that I was getting dizzy, and my service dog barked and warned me. So I said, could I please have a minute? I need to breathe. And she was kept like saying, oh, okay, so are you going to present or not? If you don't present, I'm going to give you bad marks. So she kept pushing and pushing me. And yeah, so I had a meltdown. I had to go to the hospital and whatnot. And when then I had a meeting with her later, she said that I was just pretending and exaggerating, and that I was just trying to find a way to escape the presentation, and that it's just I was just a bit of stage fright that people have when they have a presentation, but it was just pretending. So also very professional, I guess. For my bachelor thesis, I had to do it twice. My first bachelor thesis was rejected and failed because for some bogus reason, you're only allowed to be sick once during your bachelor thesis. Doesn't really matter if you're disabled and you are like everything is documented and you get sick a lot. Only, I guess, my first doctor's note was taken, and all the others were just rejected. I was never really told that until the end. Just said, yeah, so you can only be sick once, and therefore you went above the deadline and you failed the bachelor thesis. You need to do a new bachelor thesis. Yeah, thanks. And the person that wrote that letter, the secretary of the examination office, she actually called me retarded, and she mocked me for needing a caretaker for help with some things. And when I complained to the vice president of that place, well, again, he disavowed it and said it's a bad thing, but downplayed it, saying, oh, it's probably, it's just a sense of humor. And when I called out her discrimination, then he said, I am the one who's discriminating her by calling her out, which it's very rich coming from a white, able-bodied guy who's just very privileged and has never had any sort of discrimination in his life, to teach me about how I am discriminating an employee that mocked me for having a disability and called me retarded and laughed at me for needing a caretaker. So yeah. And well, I was at this Senate meeting where the Senate's mainly made of professors in that place. And I prepared myself for I want to say, because I wanted to say, you know what, you are not being discriminated. You don't know what discrimination is. Just because someone calls you out of something, that doesn't mean discrimination. You're actually very privileged. And I said it verbally. And when I finished, well, this professor who was member of the Senate actually mocked me and said, oh, okay, so I guess when it comes to presenting, you need a computer, but if you want to complain, you really can speak, huh? And then people laughed, and nobody said anything wrong about it. Nobody objected to that. So yeah. And of course, I just want to mention that's not just limited to one place. At the university where I am right now, it's also very bad. I have this employee who's allegedly representing me as a person with disabilities. And she said, well, I mean, you have extra 20 minutes in your tests, so you cannot say that you have any difficulties that a person with disability without disabilities don't have. You are the same standard. You cannot claim you have it harder. And I also had the former head of the evaluation board, and I actually think he meant it well, but he said, you know, if it's too much, I just try to go out with the dog and get some fresh air. And maybe a master's is just not for you. Maybe you should just go to a technical college or get an apprenticeship, you know, because I guess that's easier than actually granting me an accommodation, because I guess it's just me, I'm the problem. It's just I'm not capable. And the current head of the evaluation board is also, yeah. So he said granting me an accommodation in terms of time or different formulation or being able to use text speed, whatever, he says, well, first of all, that goes against the freedom of the professors. So he's restricting their freedom by granting me my rights. And also that it's unfair to other students because they are, if they are faster than I am, they deserve a better mark than I do, or I don't deserve the same mark. And yeah, so he basically said he was very gracious and, you know, I'm gonna give you like, oh, maybe 20 minutes extra or something. That's a compromise. You should at least try to meet me halfway, because of course it's a favor that he's doing me and maybe you should be very grateful. And he said, oh, you know, maybe you should just ask the professors personally, and if they want to help you and accommodate for you, they can do it, but I won't force them, because, you know, it's the quality of the education would go down if I forced that on them. So of course I tried that, and of course the professors don't have any incentive to give an accommodation because they're not told by the university to do so. So nothing changes. So he just avoids accountability. And yeah, that's just a couple of examples to break down how these issues are very prevalent and very much something that happens in everyday life, not just to me, but pretty much anyone who has to deal with higher education and being disabled. And I just want to thank a lot of people, because I want to end the presentation on a good note, because a lot of the presentation was very negative. When you're talking about discrimination and oppression, you tend to get very negative, and I want to end it on a positive note. And I think I would not be able to be what I am right now without the support of so many people. So yeah, I want to thank all the people that have supported me so far, because I wouldn't have made it so far. So yeah, thank you for listening as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing. I think that was a very important talk. Yeah. So we are a bit short in time. Do you still want to answer some questions, Sam?
Yes, of course. I'm sorry it took so long, but of course I would love to answer any questions that anyone has, or if anyone wants to comment on anything. Thank you so much for the great lecture. Emmanuel?
Yes. Hi. So first, thank you for your lecture. Sincerely, it was very informative. And I just wanted to add something about, since I'm trans myself, and I just went through the whole machine of like legal recognition and pathologization, and it is very bureaucratic and very wordy how they put it. But technically, being trans itself is not pathologized. They place it as in that they pathologize like gender dysphoria. I mean, it doesn't really make much of a difference in praxis when you actually have to meet those other people who evaluate if you're trans enough and if you're dysphoric enough. It's just like one minor detail that I wanted to mention.
As of now, in the ICD-10, gender dysphoria is not listed as an actual diagnosis, and the obsolete terminology of transsexualism as a mental illness is still being utilized. Do you know anything about the Master Diversity Inclusion of the Frankfurt University Center? Oh, yeah. Actually, honestly, I have a very difficult history with that place. I have very good experience with two professors that very supported me a lot throughout that time. But honestly, I think like if you're not a man, if you're not able-bodied, and if you're not cisgender, you should stay away from that place. Or if you want to study something that's not about making money. Honestly, I even talked to when I talked to the professors and the board of that diversity and inclusion masters, and also and the only answer I got, every single email that I sent was ignored, and the only answer I got was, "Oh, I'm sorry, I think we are not the right people to answer you because you study at Goethe University." So I don't even know what kind of answer that's supposed to be, because just because I'm in a different institution doesn't mean I cannot contact them. But yeah, it's very ironic, but it's the same way as how many places just use it for good PR, like with the whole like with the whole taking pictures of the foreign people, putting rainbow flags everywhere. It's really more about getting the bare minimum to either comply with some regulations or to create this external image of acceptance and tolerance. So, for example, I mean, in the university where I am right now, theoretically, there's even this, committee, student committee of students with disabilities, and I'm a member of it, but it's not taken seriously to the point where this office for students with disabilities doesn't even acknowledge the existence of the student committee. But by saying, oh, we have student initiatives, you at least create this sort of buffer that allows you to say, oh, we actually have so many programs. So the symbolism is the most important because it costs the less amount of resources and effort, and it also grants this ambiguity that allows for escaping accountability.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was really shocking to hear all these incidents, especially that happened at the first place. And I wanted to ask if there any consequences happened. For example, the director has been changed, or because there was so much violence done to you. And yeah, that's my question.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, as I said, I mean, that's also part of why I had the acknowledgements at the end, because honestly, a lot of, I mean, we see it with like things like how billionaires don't pay taxes or police brutality. This, just because something is illegal doesn't mean it's not going to happen. I mean, otherwise it would be like, well, I mean, what do you mean someone got murdered? Murder is illegal, right? But The thing is, I have luck. I'm very lucky that I, for example, had the support of my supervisor, the Instrument Institute, the professors at the university, the couple of professors that were still wanting to talk to me, because, for example, I went to the press and I had an article written, and the director threatened to sue me because of what was written in the first draft. So to avoid legal action, the journalists changed the narrative so that quotes that were direct from the school, for example, the letter where it says, "Oh, your grades are too good to get an accommodation," they were just changed so that it sounds like I'm complaining. Like, for example, there's a quote that I never said that says, I'm being punished for my good grades. And if you read it without context, and if you don't show the letter that says your grades are too good to get an accommodation, it just reads as some kid that just wants a medal for having a disability and just wants an extra special treatment. So so the narrative was completely broken. And so it's a very bad piece of journalism, sadly, but they still didn't like it at all. And when that happened, professors were really angry. Like many professors didn't want to talk to me or supervise my second thesis attempt. So I'm very grateful to the 2 professors of the entire faculty that still wanted to stick to me, because because basically every other professor was like, yeah, I don't want to associate with that person that talks so badly about the school. With the director, nothing has changed. He has a bad reputation for being like very right-leaning, inviting AFD politicians and then calling the police on students. I mean, like, nothing has changed at all. I even made a sent a letter where like asked for a statement, and they said, "Oh, you will get a statement back." And it never happened. I mean, I also contacted them again because I still have. There was this student with Tourette's that I helped in that school to help like get documentation and to help with tips and studying. And he told me, yeah, nothing has really changed. And I contacted the school, and they said, oh, maybe you should call the equality office, and they just never answered. And for example, I mean, impunity is there. Like, there's no real change. The same people are still there. No change in legislation has been done. I mean, no people were fired. No, actually, the director in this meeting that he offered me, he said, you cannot expect me to school the employees of the school because there are more than 100 employees, and that would be too much money and too much work to school every single employee on knowing what a service dog is. So we cannot do that. And yeah, so sadly, nothing happened. I don't think it will change. Very, very sadly. I mean, I even got a call by one of the employees saying that he was asking me if I could kick out one of my flatmates so that I could let one kid from that place that had a dog live with me, because you know, I know how it's to be with dogs, and it's probably the same thing. And he says, oh, but he has depression, so I guess it's also a therapy dog. It turned out it was a fake therapy dog, but I guess, yeah, it's just about when you're useful to a place, they will talk to you and be nice, but other than that, you're really just a problem for them because you are different from the norm. So sadly, I don't think anything will be done. I also don't have the money to sue them. And the director personally threatened to press charges against me for defamation. So thankfully, I guess that was just a threat. So he said that my going to the press caused him so much stress that he had to go to the hospital. Then I was scared, so I contacted a lawyer, and the lawyer had to contact him. And it turned out he broke his leg, and then he used the fact that he went to the hospital as a lie to say that I just caused him so much stress that he was at the hospital, but it was just a threat. So yeah, I don't think anything will happen, sadly.
Sorry. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story, Sam. You're so brave for going against the oppression, and without people like you, there is no need for the system to change, and it should. And yeah, I'm thankful you're doing a great part in this change.
Thank you. I'm very glad you could make it to the talk, and it's really nice to hear that, because it's hard when you like know that you cannot really change things. So it's very easy to just want to give up. So for example, right now I'm also in problems with the university where I'm for example trying to represent a student that that had an accident, and the school was just like, oh, maybe she can just start studying when she recovers. Right now she shouldn't start studying, which I think is horrible. And also in my case, they just want to say, oh, you should just try harder, but we cannot really change anything for you. And that's really affecting me, because I cannot really study at the same time. But it's nice to get support, because that's what kind of like gives you the motivation to not give up.
Thank you for sharing all of that with us, and I think you're really making a lot of change by sharing your story, and it really means a lot that you shared that much of it. And yeah, I'm really thankful that you're doing this.
I'm glad you liked it. And yeah, I mean, I work. Well, I also try to do political work. Sadly, I'm affiliated with a party that lost a lot of seats in the parliament, so that won't be changing anytime soon. But at least I did manage to get, for example, a new program for counseling of students with disabilities at the Goethe University. Ironically enough, the only department that rejected to participate is the Department of Computer Science, where I study. But at least it's good to know that there's this initiative working that's now backed by the university to mentor students with disabilities. So those are the successes that make it worth it.
There are a lot of really nice messages in the chat. Thank you, everyone.